History remembers Caravaggio as a revolutionary genius, a painter who dragged sacred art out of heaven and forced it to walk among ordinary, flawed, painfully human people. His shadows were darker, his saints were dirtier, his violence felt uncomfortably real, and for centuries his name has echoed through museums, textbooks, and the collective memory of Western art. But history is rarely a neutral witness. In the same turbulent era, under the same heavy Baroque shadows, another painter was working with equal intensity, equal technical mastery, and perhaps even greater emotional fury. Her name was Artemisia Gentileschi. She mastered the same dramatic light, the same brutal realism, the same psychological tension that made Caravaggio famous. Yet for generations, her story was pushed to the margins, her achievements softened, her presence treated as an exception rather than a force. This raises a more unsettling question than the usual debates about artistic genius. What if the story of art is not only about talent? What if it is also about permission? Who was allowed to be seen? Who was allowed to be heard? And who history quietly chose to place in the shadows? Because when we look closely at the lives of Caravaggio and Artemisia Gentileschi, we are not simply comparing two painters. We are confronting a deeper tension between brilliance and recognition, between skill and visibility, between those who shocked the world and those who had to fight just to stand inside it. And once you begin to see that pattern, the past starts to look far less innocent than we were taught to believe. Throughout most of recorded history, male painters did not necessarily dominate because they were more talented. They dominated because they had something far more powerful than talent: access. Access to formal training, access to workshops, access to wealthy patrons, and perhaps most importantly, access to visibility. For centuries, the structure of the art world was built in a way that quietly favored men at every critical step. Art academies across Europe often refused to admit women, especially in earlier periods. Without academy training, mastering anatomy, particularly the study of the nude human body, which was considered essential for serious historical painting, became almost impossible. Male artists could attend life drawing classes freely. Female artists were often barred from even entering the room. Workshops told a similar story. In Renaissance and Baroque Europe, artistic skill was usually transmitted through apprenticeships. Boys and young men could be placed inside established studios where they learned technique, built connections, and slowly entered professional networks. Women, unless born into artistic families, were usually locked outside this system. Talent without mentorship rarely survives in a competitive cultural economy. Patronage reinforced the same imbalance. Powerful institutions, the church, royal courts, wealthy merchants, overwhelmingly commissioned male artists, not always because female artists lacked ability, but because reputation itself was gendered. Trust, authority, and public visibility were historically coded as masculine traits. When a large altar painting or state portrait was needed, patrons tended to choose the safer, more socially accepted option. Even reputation after death followed unequal rules. Male artists were more frequently documented by early art historians such as Giorgio Vasari, whose writings helped shape the canon of Western art. Inclusion in these early histories mattered enormously. It meant preservation, copying, teaching, and long-term memory. Exclusion, on the other hand, often meant gradual disappearance. Over time, these structural advantages compounded. Each generation of recognized male masters trained new male students, received major commissions, and secured their place in the narrative of art history. While the structure of the art world favored men for centuries, women did not disappear from the history of painting. They persisted, often quietly, often against resistance, and often without the institutional support that elevated many of their male contemporaries. Their stories reveal not an absence of talent, but a pattern of constrained visibility. Some of the earliest known female painters were already working in the ancient world. Aia of Cyzicus, active in the Roman period, was praised by classical writers for her speed, precision, and ability to rival male portraitists. Remarkably, sources suggest she commanded higher prices than many of her male peers, and yet, like many women artists of antiquity, most of her actual works have not survived, leaving her reputation suspended largely in text rather than in preserved canvases. During the Renaissance and Baroque periods, the situation became both more promising and more complicated. Sofonisba Anguissola emerged in 16th century Italy as one of the first women to gain international recognition. Unlike many women of her time, she received humanist education and court patronage, eventually serving as a court painter to the Spanish monarchy. Her success demonstrated that when access barriers were partially lifted, women could compete at the highest artistic levels. Then came Artemisia Gentileschi, perhaps the most striking example of both extraordinary talent and structural resistance. Trained in the dramatic realism associated with Caravaggio's Circle, Artemisia produced works of intense psychological and physical power. Her paintings, particularly scenes like Judith slaying Holofernes, displayed a level of emotional force that modern scholars increasingly recognize as equal to many leading Baroque masters. Yet for centuries her work was often overshadowed or interpreted primarily through the lens of her personal life rather than her technical mastery, a pattern rarely applied with the same intensity to male painters. The 17th century also saw artists like Fede Galizia and Judith Leister producing refined, technically sophisticated works that circulated within professional markets. Judith Leister, for example, was successful enough in her lifetime to maintain an independent workshop in the Dutch Republic. However, after her death, several of her paintings were misattributed to the far more famous Frans Hals. Only centuries later were art historians able to correctly restore her authorship, a quiet reminder of how easily artistic credit could shift when historical documentation favored established male names. Moving into the 18th century, Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun achieved remarkable prominence as a portraitist at the court of Marie Antoinette. Her technical fluency, psychological sensitivity, and prolific output made her one of the most successful portrait painters of her generation. Yet even at the height of her career, she navigated a professional world that constantly framed her success as exceptional, not as evidence that the broader system itself might be uneven. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, artists like Berthe Morisot and Mary Cassatt became central figures in the Impressionist movement. Their brushwork, compositional innovation, and modern subject matter placed them firmly inside one of the most influential artistic revolutions in Western history. And yet, even within Impressionism, critical narratives for decades tended to foreground their male colleagues more prominently. What becomes clear across these centuries is not a simple story of exclusion or inclusion, but a pattern of uneven amplification. Women were present, women were skilled, women were sometimes even celebrated in their lifetimes. But the long-term machinery of historical memory, museums, textbooks, major retrospectives, and early art historical writing often preserved male artistic lineages more consistently. In recent decades, art historians have begun re-examining these patterns with increasing care. Archives have been reopened, attributions have been corrected, forgotten works have resurfaced, and slowly the map of art history has started to look more complex than earlier generations assumed. Because the deeper truth may be this: the history of painting was never shaped by talent alone. It was shaped by who was trained, who was commissioned, who was documented, and ultimately, who was remembered. For centuries, the debate was framed too simply. People asked whether male painters were greater, more innovative, more influential. But that question, while dramatic, may have been pointing in the wrong direction all along. Because when we look carefully at the structure of the art world across history, the pattern that emerges is not purely one of superior talent. It is a pattern of unequal conditions. Inequality in art was rarely loud. It did not always announce itself openly. Instead, it worked quietly through institutions, traditions, and expectations that shaped who could study, who could train, who could receive major commissions, and ultimately, whose names would be repeated across generations. Access to academies, permission to study the human body, entry into professional workshops, and the trust of elite patrons, these were not distributed evenly, and over time, small advantages compound into historical dominance. This does not mean the great male masters were not extraordinary. Many of them undeniably transformed the visual language of their time. But brilliance does not develop in a vacuum. It grows inside systems that either nourish it or restrict it. When one group consistently receives broader training, stronger patronage networks, and more reliable historical documentation, the long-term outcome begins to reflect structure as much as individual genius. What makes this history particularly complex is that inequality in art was rarely absolute. Women did succeed. Some gained court positions, some ran workshops, some achieved international recognition during their lifetimes. But their successes often required unusual circumstances. Supportive families, rare patrons willing to take risks, or exceptional personal resilience. In other words, the path was not closed, but it was undeniably narrower. Over generations, this uneven landscape shaped the artistic canon that museums and textbooks later presented as neutral history. Names repeated in early art historical writing became anchors of cultural memory. Names omitted slowly faded from collective awareness. The result was not necessarily a deliberate conspiracy, but a powerful form of historical momentum. Today, as scholars revisit archives and reattribute forgotten works, the picture of art history is becoming more layered and more honest. The question is no longer simply, who painted better? The more revealing question is this: how many brilliant voices required extraordinary effort just to stand in the same room as their peers? Because inequality in art was never only about skill, it was about access. It was about visibility. It was about which talents were amplified and which were left to fight the gravity of silence. And once you begin to see that pattern, the old story of artistic greatness becomes something far more complicated and far more human. And yet, the story of art history is not only a story of imbalance, it is also, slowly and unevenly, a story of expanding equality. Over the past 2 centuries, many of the structural barriers that once restricted women artists have begun to weaken, sometimes quietly, sometimes through deliberate cultural shifts that reshaped the creative world. By the 19th century, more women were gaining entry into formal art education. Academies that had once been closed began, often reluctantly, to open their doors. Life-drawing classes, long considered off-limits, gradually became more accessible. The professional studio, once an almost exclusively male domain, started to include a broader range of voices. These changes did not happen overnight, and they were far from universal, but they marked an important turning point. The 20th century accelerated this transformation. As modern art movements disrupted traditional hierarchies, the definition of artistic legitimacy itself began to evolve. Women artists were no longer confined to a narrow set of acceptable subjects. They entered avant-garde circles, experimental movements, and international exhibitions. Figures such as Berthe Morisot and Mary Cassatt were increasingly recognized not as exceptions, but as central participants in the Impressionist revolution. Later generations would push even further, challenging not only who could paint, but how art itself should be understood. Institutional change also played a crucial role. Museums, universities, and scholarly communities began reassessing earlier omissions. Lost attributions were corrected. Major retrospectives were organized. Archives were reopened with fresh questions. What had once appeared to be a fixed canon of artistic greatness slowly revealed itself to be more flexible and more incomplete than earlier historians assumed. In the contemporary art world, the landscape is more balanced than at any previous point in recorded history. Women graduate from art schools in large numbers. They lead major exhibitions. They shape global visual culture in painting, installation, digital media, and beyond. The barriers have not disappeared entirely. No cultural system becomes perfectly equal overnight. But the distance between opportunity and recognition has narrowed in ways that would have been difficult to imagine in earlier centuries. Perhaps the most important shift is not only institutional but psychological. The question is no longer whether women can stand among the great painters of history. That question has already been answered many times over. The deeper conversation today is about how we read the past, how we define artistic importance, and how carefully we examine the structures that shaped cultural memory in the first place. Because equality in art is not a single moment of arrival. It is an ongoing process, a gradual widening of the frame through which we choose to see creativity, genius, and historical legacy. And as that frame continues to expand, the story of art becomes richer, more complex, and far closer to the full human reality it always contained. In the end, the story of male and female painters is far more complex than a simple competition of talent. For centuries, both brilliance and limitation existed side by side on the same canvas. What differed was not always the quality of the work, but the conditions surrounding the artist, the doors that were open, the rooms that were closed, and the networks that quietly shaped artistic survival. If this story made you question what history chooses to remember, make sure to subscribe to The Enigmatic Veil, because here we don't just retell the past, we uncover what was hidden inside it. New historical and philosophical deep dives are coming every week. Stories of power, silence, and the moment's history almost erased. So if you want to see beyond the surface of the past, hit subscribe and join us behind the veil, because sometimes the most important truths in history are the ones that were never meant to be seen.